May it please the court. Ms. Jensen, Mr. Myers, members of the jury. As I told you earlier, I guess all last week, my name is Michael Griffith. I'm being assisted by Sharon Wilson and my legal assistant, Cheryl Young. I heard Ms. Jensen's opening statement and it was masterful, but it leaves out many of the facts or the lack of facts that you are going to hear. First of all, what can we agree to? We can agree that Voncile Smith, Richard Thomas Smith, and John Smith were horribly murdered. There is no question about that, and that is a tragedy. We can also agree that my client, Donald Hartung, Sr., would go every Tuesday night to his mother's house and cook dinner for the three of them that lived there. That's Richard, John, and Voncile. This went on for years and years. And he would also visit on occasion to watch football over there. Now, you will hear testimony about DNA. You would expect, and the experts pertaining to DNA will tell you, that of course my client's DNA would be all over the house on Klondike simply because he visited there, on Deerfield, because he visited there all the time. DNA is deposited by all of us through our skin cells, our hair, our perspiration, and for Mr. Hartung's DNA to be all over that house is nothing that is surprising to anyone. In Mr. Hartung's interview, he's asked about touching Richard's property, and he says, no, I didn't touch it. Does that mean he didn't move it if it was in the kitchen when he was cooking? Absolutely not. He didn't go through it. He told the detectives that. You're also going to hear what contact DNA is. I suggest to you that you'll hear testimony that contact DNA means when I'm here and I'm touching this lectern, if someone were to put my legal assistant's purse on top of it, that my DNA could be on her purse, not because I touched her purse, but because she put it on top of my DNA. That is what's called contact DNA. There are numerous instances such as that we will put on as evidence either through the cross-examination of the state's evidence or if we choose to put on a defense through our experts to educate you and give you a better understanding of what it is that you're dealing with. Now, as far as the will is concerned, what the will says that Donald Hartung Jr. is excluded. My client is Donald Hartung Sr. Is that an error in drafting the will, or was it meant to exclude Mr. Hartung's son, Donald Hartung Jr.? We don't know. But there's one thing that the state cannot tell you or prove to you is that my client ever saw that will. There is no evidence that my client ever read that will, saw that will, or in any way had knowledge of the contents of the will. Additionally, you won't hear any evidence from anyone that says that my client knew or didn't know whether or not Richard Thomas Smith had a will. The state is, I suggest to you, basing their theory that they're trying to put forward that my client knew the contents of the will and that was his motivation to kill his family. No evidence. I suggest to you that you will hear, and this is what you need to listen to. Listen to not only what the state puts on, but use your minds to rationally think about whether there's a lack of evidence or whether there's a conflict in the evidence. I'll suggest no one will tell you whether or not my client knew if Richard had a will or not. And if he were the last to die, then whoever he left his money to is where it would go. It wouldn't necessarily go to Donald Hartung Sr. But this is a supposition that the state has made. I suggest to you that you're also going to hear that none of the investigators had any suspect beside my client. They didn't bother looking at anyone else. They did a quick fix, if you would, zeroed in on my client, whose DNA was at the house, absolutely, and decided he must be the murderer. The hammer that Ms. Jensen told you about. You'll have to listen to the DNA results to see if my client's DNA was even on that hammer. Certainly John's, Richard's, and Voncile's were on the hammer. There is not going to be, at the conclusion of this case, anyone who is going to stand up and say, I did it, I'm the person that committed the murders. It's not Perry Mason. You're not going to hear that. I suggest to you at the conclusion of the case, there is no answer to who the murderer is. I also suggest to you that when you listen to the evidence, you will have a great deal of doubt as to who committed these murders. We know they were committed. We know it's a tragedy. We also are going to suggest that through the evidence, you're going to see that no one was investigated besides my client, and that a great deal of the reason my client was arrested was because of his DNA, which you would expect to find all over the house. You're going to see that he readily answered all the questions of law enforcement, didn't refuse to answer their questions. They questioned him shortly after he learned his family had been murdered. They came back later that night, again, questioned him, searched his house. There is no indication of any physical evidence that he committed any of the murders. There was no gun found. There was no gunshot residue found on any of his clothing. There was no blood found at his house. There was no blood found in his car. There was nothing to link him in any way to these murders besides his DNA at his mom's house, where he went at least every Tuesday to cook dinner for her and his two half-brothers. You're not going to hear any testimony, I suggest, that in any way says that he didn't like his family, that he was mad at his mother, that he was mad at his brothers. There is nothing. These murders, when you see the photographs of the crime scene, they were done in a rage, an angry rage. You are not going to hear any testimony from any witness that's going to say my client had an explosive temper, ever yelled, screamed at his mother or his brothers, or in any way fought with them. In fact, he dearly loved his family. I suggest to you at the conclusion of the case, after you hear the state's evidence, which obviously is slanted towards convicting my client. There's no question about that. That's what the state wants to do, is convict my client. And that's the way they're going to present their evidence. Through cross-examination, and if Mr. Hartung and his attorneys choose to put on evidence, you're going to hear something totally different, that there's no way that we know who committed these murders. There's no way beyond a reasonable doubt that you could find that Mr. Hartung is guilty of these murders. Thank you.